In this video, we're going to be talking about the fact that the police can lie to you and they can engage in deceptive tactics when conducting an investigation or an interrogation. Now, before I proceed further, I know that probably if you're watching this video, you don't plan on ever having an interaction with the police, at least not a negative one. You don't ever plan on being investigated or interrogated, but hey, nobody wakes up and says, hey, it's a good day to get arrested, but sometimes people find themselves in sticky situations. And for me, this channel has always been about informing people, keeping them aware of their rights so that they can protect themselves and make sure that they're being treated fairly within the system. So let's get into it. And there are going to be a couple of examples that I give in terms of context as to how the police do engage in lies or deceptive tactics. And one of the things is, especially with undercover cops, right? For some reason, people have this idea that, because law enforcement is, as the name implies, law enforcement, enforcing the laws. They wear a badge. They take their sworn officers. They call it sworn peace officers. There's this thought that they're not allowed to lie. We're going to talk about two different instances in which cops routinely lie as part of their investigation. And that first example is going to be in solicitation of prostitute cases. Now, I don't judge myself. At the end of the day, I understand that, there's a market out there for people who want to pay to play. And, there are all kinds of websites, and sometimes people actually use just general dating sites to set up, sex for money dates. And a lot of times if a guy ends up getting caught up, right? So he's thinking he's going to pay for sex, pay a prostitute for sex, and it turns out that he's interacting with an undercover cop. If he ends up going through with the transaction, or at least like showing up to the hotel or what have you, and they arrest him or they cite him, when he inevitably gets charged with soliciting a prostitute, then he's going to have a right to discovery. And part of the discovery in these cases ends up being the communications to set up the date, right? So they're either going to be text messages or emails back and forth where they're talking about the details. How long will it be? Is it going to be 15 minutes? Is it going to be half an hour? Is it going to be an hour? What am I allowed to do? What's off limits, right? Where are we going to meet up? Okay, I have this hotel room at the Holiday Inn or wherever it's going to be at, and the cost, right? So once they have all these details down, there's obviously a clear intent to exchange sex for money. And then when the guy shows up, that's when he ends up getting arrested. Well, part of that dialogue will oftentimes include where the guy's like, well, you're not a cop, right? And then the cop will respond because the guy, and this is the big misconception, he thinks that if he calls out the cop, right? Well, actually, he doesn't think it's a cop. He thinks it's a legit prostitute, but he thinks if he throws that out there, and if it does happen to be a cop, then that cop has to say, okay, well, you got me. Yes, we're law enforcement. Let's go and shut this thing down, go along your way. But that doesn't happen. The cop will then respond and be like, LOL, no, WTF. And they, the good ones will then come back and say, well, are you a cop? Right. and then the guy comes back and he's like, no. So now he's defending himself, trying to prove that he's not a cop. Right. So no, the police do not have to admit that they're undercover and that they're merely posing as prostitutes in that situation. So that's one area where they often lie. The second context where this comes up a lot is in drug transactions. Now, this is probably something that you've seen in the movies pretty often, where you have an undercover cop who's posing as a buyer, and then you have an actual drug dealer who's wanting to sell his product, right? And so this is obviously set up because the undercover cop wants to have the drug dealer sell him the drugs, and so they can make the arrest and get all the bad guys and put them in jail, right? And so a lot of times, just as you see in the movies, the drug dealer's asking, hey, are you a cop? And then the undercover cop obviously is not going to say, oh, yeah, you got me. Operation shut down. Like, no, he says, no, I'm not a cop. And he might fire back. Are you law enforcement? Right? Same thing. And, oftentimes you'll see that drug dealer then challenge the cop and say, hey, well, if you're not a cop, then shoot him, right? And then he ends up shooting the guy in the foot, right? That's just the cost of doing the business, right? But it's perfectly legal for the police to engage in these type of deceptive tactics in their investigations or in interrogations. And there's a major case on this where the Supreme Court had decided that these type of actions are legal by law enforcement. In that case, we're going to nerd out a little bit. This case was called Frasier versus Cupp, and it was a 1969 case that ended up going before the Supreme Court. And what happened in that case was there was a 20-year-old Marine named Martin Frasier who was under investigation as a suspect for a murder, right? Mr. Frasier and his cousin were seen at a bar with the victim before they were murdered. Frasier ends up getting taken to the station and they're seeking to interrogate him, right? And what the police does is he tells Frasier, hey, we already spoke to your cousin and your cousin admitted to his involvement and he pointed the finger at you. So he told him, you might as well just do the right thing and confess. Probably made him promises of a better deal and all of that. You know how the story goes. And so he confessed and he ended up getting arrested. He was charged with the murder of this victim and ultimately he was found guilty at trial. And the confession was used against him. So on appeal, his lawyers had argued, amongst a bunch of other things, that that confession was illegally obtained. And the Supreme Court ultimately held, they didn't exactly hold that the police could lie, but what they said was, the police's activity in this situation was not sufficient to make what was otherwise a voluntary confession inadmissible. Frasier versus Cupp has been cited a number of times later on in appellate court cases. It's supporting the idea that police are allowed to engage in deceptive tactics and even lie in their investigations and interrogations. And so when you think about, just the rationale behind it, obviously, police, they investigate criminal activity. And so the thought process is, hey, we're going to allow them to get a little down and dirty for the purpose of the greater good, right? To reduce criminal activity and, put away the bad guys, right? I mean, you can on some level understand the rationale behind it. This just goes to, bring out even greater importance to Miranda. And when you're issued that warning, hey, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. That is an accurate statement, and a lot of times that is what ends up happening. If you end up making an admission, you end up confessing to a crime, that statement will certainly be used against you. But Miranda doesn't kick in until you're in custody, right? Or if it's considered a custodial interrogation. So you don't necessarily have to be in police custody at the jail for Miranda to apply. If you're in a situation where you don't feel like you're free to leave, or they tell you that you're not free to leave, then Miranda applies and they're supposed to read you your rights. But really, independent of Miranda, just understand that anytime police want to question you, you have the right to shut that down and say, I want an attorney present. I'm not going to answer any questions without my lawyer. You don't have to be rude about it. You don't have to be disrespectful about it, but you do have to be crystal clear and you do have to be assertive about it, because there was also in that same case in Frasier versus Cupp, when they were talking to him, I believe he said something to the effect of, oh, well, it might be a good idea to talk, with a lawyer, or it might be a good idea to call up a lawyer. And if you're like, if you're waffling about that, it's not a straight up statement. I will not make any further statements without my lawyer present, or I don't want to talk to you. Unless it's crystal clear like that, then, it's not going to be enough. So you really have to be clear in your assertion that you're not going to make any statements without your lawyer present. It's just important to remember that at the end of the day, the police, especially the good cops, I think they're the most effective at this stuff. They're not going to put in a good word with the DA. They're not going to put in a good word with the judge. They're not going to get you a better deal because you told on yourself. There is no advantage to you whatsoever. There is no advantage to you giving statements to police. So it's better to just assert your constitutional right to remain silent, wait to speak to your lawyer, and allow the attorney to do his job to either completely clear your name, or even if you did do something, let him do his job or let her do her job to put you in the best position to get the best deal possible given the circumstances. And I talk about that in my video here that I'm linking above. Remember, police are allowed to lie to you. They often do. And, you're not going to be able to use as some sort of legal defense the fact that they lied to you. If you got something out of this, please show me some love, hit the like button, make sure you subscribe to the channel, and turn on those notifications so you never miss a video when it drops. As always, I want to thank you so much for watching, and until next time, peace.